You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Debato. Today, my very special guests are Jonathan Sweet and Mark Toth. Jonathan is a retired U.S. Army colonel. He served for over 30 years in the military intelligence branch of the Army, and his tours include duty with the 101st Airborne Division and INSCOM, which is the intelligence and security command of the U.S. Army. He also led the U.S. European Command Intelligence Engagement Division from 2012 to 2014. Mark writes on national security and foreign policy. Previously, Mark was an economist and entrepreneur. He's worked in banking, insurance, publishing, and global commerce. He's a former board member of the World Trade Center in St. Louis and has lived in U.S. diplomatic and military communities all over the world. Jonathan and Mark regularly publish pieces together in various publications such as the Kyiv Post and The Hill. And in fact, we're going to be discussing one of those articles right now during this episode. Jonathan and Mark, welcome back to the No Delusion Zone.
David, thanks for having us back. Always a great opportunity to talk with you.
Great to be here. Thanks, David.
You bet to both of you. Talking off air, and we're going to get right into it. Obviously, there's enough to talk about. We could go on all day, but we don't have the time. I think you both know, and certainly the viewers of my channel know how I feel about what's gone on since the Munich Security Conference with Vice President J.D. Vance, General Kellogg, and the ensuing comments by President Trump. To say that I'm livid would be a vast understatement. The 80 years since World War II, the alliances that we've built up, that the United States built up as really the founding member of NATO and created what really arguably is a Pax Americana, the safest and arguably most peaceful time in human history. Yes, there were conflicts. We didn't have a world war. Europe was not in flames until now. That's gone. Within a matter of days, the United States, the founder of Pax Americana, of peace in the Western world, has utterly destroyed it. Maybe permanently, maybe not. But the world is really on its ear right now. I don't know what else to say. I'm almost out of words, but then again, being who I am, I'll never be out of words. So I'll keep on. But obviously, I want to hear what you two have to say about the last week. I asked you off air. I'll ask you on air now. I know that you two rightfully try to stay neutral when it comes to politics, but I don't think even you two can do that now. What was the biggest takeaway that you, Mark and Jonathan, took from the events? Let's start in the Munich Security Conference. What's the biggest surprise, the biggest takeaway you've taken from that?
I'll start off real quick, David. Look, I think everything you mentioned for the past week, starting with the security conference and pretty much ending with the with the initial discussion between the two negotiation teams, the United States and Russia, from our perspective, or at least from my perspective specifically, has been disappointing. The America First agenda has its place, but that place isn't necessarily in the peace talks or negotiation talks between the United States and Russia. This is a war between Ukraine and Russia, and NATO is heavily involved in supporting one side, whereas Iran, North Korea, and China are heavily involved in supporting the other side. So bitterly disappointed in where we're going, because from my perspective, as we look at this is more about America first and looking beyond the war. This is about bringing the war to a conclusion as quickly as possible so we can get back to the business of business. And I think for me, that's probably the singularly most disappointing aspect of last week. Mark?
Yeah, I'd say, I always try to bring, a calm approach to what we do and take the emotion out of it, because emotion can sometimes lead you to rabbit holes that don't lead to solid conclusions. And so having said that, my sense of what we're seeing here is almost like a Get Shorty movie, Why are we going after Zelensky at this moment in time? Why are you seeing Elon Musk piling on, Tucker Carlson piling on? Why are you seeing the lies that are just spewing out of the mouth of Trump about having 4% approval ratings of, not basically stealing hundreds of billions of dollars that were never appropriated, let alone dispersed by the U.S. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation coming out of the White House and people associated with the White House. And so it's kind of like, why get shorty? And I think for me, obviously that's disappointing. That's the biggest disappointment out of this. But I think the reasoning behind it is twofold. I do think in this fog of this war that Trump is waging here, it is about getting Europe to do more, but it's only because Trump is not interested in winning in Ukraine. He, for whatever reason, the people around him, et cetera, they want to pivot to China. They want to be focusing on the threat that Beijing represents. And he just wants to get out of the war in Ukraine, what he thinks is a drain, which he thinks is a bad economic deal. Again, not a good idea. I mean, giving Putin a win is giving Xi a win in China. It makes no sense, but that I think is the rationale. And so for me, the biggest disappointment of what we're seeing out of the Munich conference and everywhere, the contact group that happened in Brussels earlier in the week with Hesketh, all of that, the disappointment is they don't see the value of winning in Ukraine. That's ridiculous. And then just one last quick point here. Obviously, that all plays into the Pax Americana, the idea that the U.S., is the world's policeman, is a force for good. All of that gets undermined and weakened. And I think it's going to come back to bite us in the Indo-Pacific because we're letting go of a very important role that we have in NATO. And it's going to just, the repercussions won't be good.
Hey, David, let me add one thing to what Mark just said. It's the pattern that we're seeing right now. And Mark's exactly right. If we're willing to do this, when I say we, the United States is willing to do this to our European partners, you have to wonder right now what South Korea, Japan, Australia, what our partners in the Pacific are thinking could happen to them. Is economics more of a player than national security? And when will the U.S. bail on us? So that's an important point I think we need to emphasize.
Well, let me throw this out here now. It was no surprise to me and many, many who think the way I do about the Trump administration, but I know it was a shock to many, maybe most, even people who do pay attention to politics and are following what's going on in Ukraine and in Europe. It was a shock to many to see the abrupt about face of people like Marco Rubio. Someone who was recently, I think it was a year ago, who was one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine and the staunchest critics of Russia, to do such a Kremlin talking points type of a statement from Riyadh. And I know both of you like General Kellogg. I do too, from what I've read about him, but I'm sorry. He was co-opted in some way. Maybe he's afraid, maybe he needs the money, but he has mouthed the talking points of Trump in terms of, it was several weeks ago actually, or maybe even in December, where he said that Ukraine is going to have to give away some territory and NATO's probably not in the cards, or I'm paraphrasing. This was way before negotiations even started. I knew it was all downhill then. And what's going on in Riyadh was just a disgrace. What J.D. Vance said is no surprise to anybody. He's a moron, and I don't consider him to be much of an American either. But what Marco Rubio did, what all of the Republicans, especially in the Senate guys, did, as far as being silent, what they did is nothing about what Trump has said about Zelensky being a dictator. What an insult. And for Trump literally mouthing Kremlin talking points about Ukraine never joining NATO, about America. Well, this was not the talking points, but America having given Ukraine $350 billion. Not true. About $100 billion. And a lot of that came back to defense contractors. I could go on, but I think my point is I'm not surprised, but I think most Americans were surprised at the abrupt about face of the chameleons like Marco Rubio, who went from supporting Ukraine and criticizing Russia to criticizing Ukraine and supporting Russia and just supporting every lie that Trump has told. Your thoughts?
Yeah, let me start with. Yeah, let me start with that. I think one thing to remember here is that we're only, as we tape this, 1 month to the day of Trump taking office. It feels like he's been in office for a year now. I mean, when you think about everything that's happened in this, 30-day time frame, if you will, since he's taken it started his second administration, there's a lot to digest. I think what we're seeing initially, I think in people like General Kellogg, is the rug's been pulled out from under them. And I think they're trying to figure out how to adapt to that, how to keep a voice at the table. How do they try to influence Trump away from this? At the end of the day, though, they do serve at the discretion of the president. So it's a question of, are they at a resignation point? Do they say, nope, we can't sign on to this? Or do they try to yet retrieve the position? And I suspect, without trying to defend them, because I'm just as disappointed in the statements that are coming out of them as you are, David. I'm not defending what they're saying. But I kind of get why only 30 days into an administration, they may not be knowing how to react. And so at this point, given that they're tasked with delivering the president's words and not their own, I think we're seeing that play out. Now, if that continues, if they don't start stepping up to the plate and doing more, then yeah, these guys deserve to go. They need to resign. They need to stand up for what's right. They need to be consistent with their past statements. Marco Rubio in particular, there's tweets out there. People are already citing them where, back, I think in 2022, he called Putin a dictator. He blamed Putin for the invasion. You can't do a 180 on that and somehow say, yeah, no, I didn't believe that. But again, his job is to carry the president's policy, not his own. And if you can't agree with it, he needs to resign. And so hopefully those kind of conversations are beginning to happen. But right now, clearly they're not, because, it's clearly a pile on that get shorty aspect of it that I just mentioned about Zelensky. But we'll see. John?
Yeah, gone are the strong personalities that Trump surrounded himself with in the first administration. McMaster's, the Mathises, the Kellys, the Boltons. Gone are the ones that would stand up to Trump's external thinking, if you will, thinking out loud and keeping him in check. It seems this group of individuals, Rubio, Waltz, Wyckoff, Kellogg, Vance, it seems as though they come off now as followers. And right, as Mark said, they were brought on board and they signed up to do a job and follow their president. But there does come a point, I believe, where somebody, I mean, and the military guys, Kellogg, Waltz, have to step back and I think honestly look at Russia and say, is this really what we're going to do? Are we really going to side saddle with Putin and make these? I mean, is it really about business or is it about the security of our partners in Eastern Europe? And I'm not sure what point it's going to take for those individuals to step up and make those points made to the president. But we're clearly desynced. And part of the desync part is we don't have a strategy. I still don't know what a strategy is. We've lost the strategy from the Biden administration. We're now into the Trump administration. The national security strategy doesn't exist. The American public doesn't understand what's going on. And quite frankly, I think Team Trump is desynchronized. They're all on different glide paths, and they're constantly, covering for the other or issuing statements or back statement what the other has said. So I think it's time to take a knee for a little bit, get their act together, and then come back out. But they're gonna have to explain to the American public what their end state is. And right now, that's unclear.
Well, let me throw this out for both of you and tell me your thoughts. There isn't a plan. I mean, I've said this about Trump every time that you've been on, and I say it every time anybody ever asks me. Trump doesn't have a strategy about anything other than what's best for me. So he's given his people marching orders to, I don't know what to do. I think that his strategy, if you can call it that, is to end this war as quickly as possible. And the way to do that, in his art of the deal kind of a brain, which he didn't write that book anyway, is to give Russia whatever he wants. Talk to Putin and say, okay, yeah, they're not going to join NATO. Yeah, you can keep that territory, and on and on and on. Basically telling Marco Rubio to agree with everything he said, pretty much, and let's get this thing done. Let's just get it done, because he wants the Pulitzer Prize for peace. He also wants to be known, worldwide as the man who ended the war. He doesn't care how it ends. That may sound emotional and shrill, because it is emotional and shrill. I don't like him. He's sacrificing millions of Ukrainians, not to mention what's going to happen later in Europe, just because he wants to be the big man. So he doesn't have a strategy. He's going to end this very, very soon. I think Marco Rubio's flying by the seat of his pants, just taking what he can get from his master's marching orders. And it's disgusting. There is no plan. There is no strategy. And this is going to end very, very badly for Ukraine. I think what we've seen in the initial negotiations, all due respect, Mark, I think this is it. I know it's only been 30 days, but in the military, you're ordered. You're told you have to refuse an unlawful order. Now, these aren't unlawful, but they're certainly unethical, immoral. And for anybody that served against the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation after that, to immediately side with the Russians across from Lavrov and agree with everything they said, this goes against everything that anybody that's been in the military, especially MI, and you know this, Jonathan, no, you have to quit now. Tender your resignation, fall on your sword, and get the hell out. There's no time limit for that. It has to happen now. That's my piece. Thoughts?
Yeah, look, interesting that everything you said is in one way or another, we have referenced in the article on the Hill this morning.
Which we're going to talk about next, I promise.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It is right now all about closing the deal. It's just, let's stop the war, stop the killing at whatever cost so we can get back to the business of business. And I think when you look at all the concessions that are made, one of the points that Mark and I made is this: what concessions been made in favor of Ukraine? It's NATO inclusion? No. Peacekeeping forces in Ukraine? No. A disarmament of military in Ukraine? No. Forcing elections upon Ukraine while they're in contact with Russia? I mean, all these concessions that are being made, what favors Ukraine? What is helping Ukraine? And right now, the answer is none. And oh, by the way, when's the last election that's occurred in Eastern Europe not been influenced by Russia? Look at Moldova. Let's look at Georgia. Let's look at Romania most recently, some of the interferences that was going on. And if you believe the Democrats, from their perspective of the last election, at least 2016 and 2020, Russian interference in U.S. elections. So why do you not think that Russia is going to get their guy into position in Ukraine and they capitulate? And then what's going to happen to all of the Ukrainians and their culture if Russia moves into Ukraine? It's at the end of the day, it goes away. Putin has been very exact about what he thinks about Ukraine, and the word is simple, okay, but no one wants to apply it to Ukraine. They're very quick to apply it to the Middle East, but the genocide, the lost culture of Ukraine is what's at risk. And I feel as though the path we're going down, or potentially could be going down, is going to set conditions for that to eventually happen within the next couple of years. Mark?
Thank you. This is genocide. I have to second you on that. And You're right. Nobody's talking about it outside the Middle East.
Yeah, just look at what Russia has said, what they have done, and what they continue to do. It's nothing short of, they're really quick to apply that term in the Middle East, but nobody wants to hold Russia accountable for it, because then you have to do something about it. And nobody wants to confront Russia. Even though Putin is at his absolute weakest point right now, nobody wants to do anything about it because it's Russia. Mark?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at what we saw this week in terms of attacks in Ukraine, right after the Riyadh meetings, or right after any big statements made by Trump or Trump officials, what was Putin doing? They were attacking Ukrainian cities, civilian targets. So, I mean, genocide's clearly on display there. Hey, David, I would push back one thing on the plan. And again, I think this is just trying to understand Trump's world as opposed to me projecting my own views onto him. There is, I think, a plan here. I don't like it. You and I share the same assessment of it. If it is indeed a plan, it's crazy. And I agree with you that he's got shark-like instincts, so that, when you're looking at him just operating on a daily basis, he's just, opportunistic. And what he says in the morning sometimes contradicts what he ultimately says in the evening. And it's hard to write about the guy. But I do think there's a plan from their standpoint. And that plan is to pivot to China. And it's a weird kind of plan that has come out of this, I call it a hybrid form of pre-World War II conservative isolationism and modern day libertarianism. this idea that on the one hand, we really want to be exiting the world stage as a policeman. We want Europe to do more, take on more of that load so that we don't have to contend with that. But then on the flip side, he's surrounded by these China hawks. And if you look at how he's appointed these guys, Ratcliffe, Waltz, Rubio, these are guys who have long argued that China, and they're not incorrect here, that China is the pacing military threat that the US is facing. They want to pivot to that. Now, they want to pivot to it too soon. They don't realize that they're interconnected. That's their mistake, but that is the plan. And I think what you have to do sometimes to understand a plan is get away from Trump's verbiage and language and his tendency to try to blow things up to get attention on himself. And you need to look, dig down to the levels of the policymakers that are influencing him. And one guy in particular is a man by the name of Elbridge Colby, who is getting some pushback in terms of getting his approval as a DOD undersecretary through Congress or through the Senate right now. And this is a guy who has long argued, long articulated. He's a former Trump administration official in the first term. He's long said that, look, we need an accommodation with Russia. Russia is not our primary enemy. We just need to be very transactional, cut a deal in the war in Ukraine because we're draining resources that we need to fight. And he believes is an existential fight with China. And so he's making that argument. And I think that's found currency with Trump. And so I do think that's the plan. It's an effed up plan, if I can be rude here, on the no delusion zone.
Absolutely.
It doesn't take into account the fact that, we're not going to peel off Russia from China. That relationship now is solidified. But I do think there's a plan there, even if it's a bad plan, a mad plan. I think in terms of those of us that are trying to articulate what the hell is going on here, it's important to be able to dig down to that and understand what we're up against, because if you can't figure that out, then you can't create messaging to, thwart it, to make an argument for a different and better kind of plan.
Mark, let me follow up if I could real quick, because I'm about to write an article about kind of what you're talking about. My thesis has been for a while, and I'd like to hear both of your thoughts, but especially Mark, since you brought this up. I believe the whole point, the whole impetus of Trump and MAGA, generally, the conservatives, the Republican Party, pivoting towards China and giving Russia a pass. In fact, supporting the Kremlin in many, many of its moves, including right now with Ukraine, is racism. The Christian nationalist movement is very strong in MAGA, as I'm sure you both know, and they are naturally aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church, whom Putin is very well aligned with. I believe, and I think there's evidence for this, that one of the main reasons that the MAGA movement, the Christian nationalists, the evangelical wing of the MAGA movement is supporting Russia and pivoting totally towards China is because they're the other. They're the other. They're not Christian. They're certainly not. They're foreigners, and they're darker skin. I know that sounds horrible, but I'm sorry. Read about what MAGA says. Read Christian nationalism rhetoric. I think that's a big driving force behind this. It's not been talked about because I guess it's politically incorrect on both sides, but I believe this to be true, and I'm going to write about it. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not a domestic political expert, so it's just kind of my opinion. I personal opinion here without a lot of evidence to support it. I think what you're seeing in the MAGA culture, which is very middle class, I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of who MAGA is at its core. It's middle class Americans that do view this as a culture war. I think a lot of people got lost in this argument that this was an economic war, that, working class Americans had said enough. I think what they were saying enough to was a culture war. And so from that standpoint, in terms of their grievances about DEI, their grievances about, overreach of the federal government into their lives, not being able to say Merry Christmas to their kids in schools, all of that plays into their worldview. And I think they look at Russia and they at least see the optics of Christianity. They see the church services, Christmas Eve, all those kind of things, and they think that's what our country was once like. That's the childhood that we remember, or the childhood that my parents or grandparents provided for me, and they yearn to kind of get back to that. But look, Americans are distanced from Russia. They don't understand everything else connected to it. So I don't know, if we can go as far as saying that they're racist. I think it's more just a yearning for a time that's past in the US, and they're wanting to go back to that. I think the motivation is culture. I do think, obviously, clearly there are racists,
Well, Mark, I mean the architects of this. I
right,
totally agree that MAGA is mostly middle class, but I'm taking the architects, the ones that are the elites and in charge that are
yeah.
whispering to Trump. I believe they are the racists that are pushing the pivot towards
Right.
China and leaning more positively towards the Kremlin.
Yeah, it could be. Unfortunately, I just don't know enough to kind of comment on that. It's certainly something, I agree with you, explore, see if those dots are there. I just don't have personal knowledge of it. I've not looked at them. I've not looked at their statements, to make any kind of determination along that line. But I think what it is, just in general, and maybe they're going to use racism as a tool, right? I mean, you may find that in your research. I do think it's just wanting to recreate America that, John and I, frankly, probably you too, that we grew up with in the 60s, that's a world gone by and they want it back.
No, I agree with you. The middle class, the core, the power behind MAGA. No, I believe that, and oddly enough, I do agree with some of that sentiment. I'm not a fool. I love nostalgia. I love thinking about Christmases gone by and holidays. But I really do believe this, and I am going to do some research. I believe not with the middle class in MAGA. They don't study world events. They're not thinking about the religion of China versus the religion of Russia, but they're just thinking about what they see and what they hear, and they're saying, okay, we're going to, Russia's kind of like us. And that's what the Russian propaganda says. We're just like you, America. We believe in Christianity and Jesus and Christmas, and we don't like gay and trans and all those things. That's music to the ears of a lot of people in MAGA. And with China, they're Asian. We can blame Asians. They don't look like us. And what the heck kind of a religion do they have anyway? They don't even celebrate Christmas. Maybe they're all gay. We don't know, but they're different. And President Trump tells us they're the main enemy. So they are.
Yeah, no, let me just quickly make clear here, racism obviously is wrong. Any form of racism is wrong. Just from a national security standpoint, which is the angle that John and I look at, I haven't detected that in any of the policymakers. I don't see it in the verbiage. I don't see it in terms of the positions that they put forward. Now, they may be doing it personally, and they may be doing it on other platforms that I simply have missed because I'm not tracking that. But in terms of looking at the policies, I haven't seen that yet. But I just want to be clear, John and I are vehemently opposed to any kind of racism, has no place in our foreign policy, and it shouldn't inform what the threats of the country are. I mean, the threats are simply Beijing's militarization and determination to dominate. It doesn't have anything to do with the race or the culture of the Chinese people.
I understand. I wanted to throw it out there because I do believe it's a factor. Is it the major factor? I don't know yet, but I wanted to throw it out there. Let's get to your article. You just published a new article in The Hill, and the title is "Tired of Winning?" Good, because Trump is losing in Ukraine. So if you could, I would like you both to just summarize or talk about the new article you wrote in The Hill.
Yeah, it's and we've discussed some of it already, but what we're seeing is that at least from our perspective, is that all the current decisions, all of the rhetoric, all of the sound bites concerning Ukraine are all negative, and they're all in a position, if you will, to empower Russia. And the American public hasn't bought into Russia winning. The American public, if I'm not mistaken, by some of the last polls, 60 to 70% of Americans still support Ukraine. So taking that position, I think, from the Trump perspective, is a losing proposition. You're going against the grain, regardless of what you think the outcome is going to be. Right now, the majority of the American public doesn't believe in that. So for me, it's a losing proposition. You're taking us down the wrong hole. And again, this is the same Trump that we said right at the beginning of the article, when he first ran for president, when he came back and ran for president again in 2024. It's all about winning. Hey, Americans are going to win. We're going to get so much winning. We're going to be tired of winning. And we state right up front, isn't it odd that America is tired of winning in February of 2025, 1 month after the president has taken office. The American First agenda, domestically at least, I think most folks are on board with what's going on as far as security reforms, tariffs. I'm not sure what the exact numbers are, but I think for the most part, Americans are on board with that. But American First agenda concerning our partnership with NATO, American First agenda concerning European security, there's other reports, and whether they're valid or not, I don't know. I mean, I'm watching this on Twitter. I'm seeing some articles on social media about the United States pulling U.S. forces out of NATO countries that weren't NATO countries, prior to 1990. And I think that's a terrible mistake, because what that does, and Mark and I have talked about this a lot, Putin doesn't fear NATO. Putin doesn't fear the Europeans. Putin fears Americans. He is very respectful of American capability. And if you take American forces out of the Baltics, if you take American forces out of Poland, if you take American forces out of Romania, okay, I don't think Putin's concerned about a NATO response if he goes in those areas, if the American government is not involved. Okay. He knows that America leads NATO. He knows that NATO goes where America goes. And by pulling U.S. forces out of those areas, it creates opportunities for him. But more importantly, from my perspective, David, is this: he is driving a wedge right now between the United States and what Mark and I have called old NATO, new NATO. Okay, he is driving a wedge between new NATO and the United States and creating the friction that he wasn't able to create in the first 3 years. Yes, we added 2 new countries to NATO, but now he's tearing it down, and he's using a tool. And right now, that tool would be the Trump administration to sow further divisiveness between them. It isn't an odd that Pete Hegseth was just in Poland last week, right? Doing PT with his Polish counterparts, talking up Poland about how strong they were, but at the same time also, at least out loud, saying, yeah, we might withdraw U.S. forces from here because we don't want to agitate Russia, because we're right there on the border, bordering countries with Russia. And that's what they've been angry about all this time. So we're not going to antagonize them. But NATO forces are there. That doesn't antagonize them. No, what it's all about is getting U.S. reaction away from the border. Okay, and that, I think, is most frustrating. And I think we emphasize that in our reporting, or in our writing, is that we're going down a losing path. We're going to lose our partners. We're going to lose Ukraine. We're going to lose security. And at the end of the day, the Ukrainian identity could be lost based upon decisions that are going to be made today. And oh, by the way, just because the United States and Russia come to an agreement doesn't mean that Ukraine and Europe are going to acknowledge that agreement. Okay, and I think that's the part that the Trump administration doesn't understand or won't accept. They think they make the decision, they're going to dictate to Europe and Ukraine what they're going to do. They're not counting on pushback. And right now, Zelensky's already said, I'm not signing anything that my people aren't part of the negotiating process with. Even though Rubio a couple of days ago said, we'll get them on board once we made the decisions, more or less paraphrasing the quote that he gave. So again, a losing proposition. And since when, as Patton said, America's love a winner, and right now this is not winning, and not good for the country. Mark, what do you got to add?
Yeah, I'd put an exclamation mark on the concept of losing, because I think that's what we're facing with here. One of my jobs, not to bore people, was being the asset liability manager of a banking group. So it was my job to look 10 years out, to shock the balance sheet, shock the income statement, to make sure that we maintained our margin of earnings, no matter what would happen. It was my job to manage that, use interest rate swaps, whatever I needed to do to keep that margin consistent. And so I tend to look out 10 years, further, in terms of my own insight, in terms of analyzing national security issues and the like. And I think history is not going to be kind to Trump. I know history is not going to be kind to Trump if Ukraine fails. It's going to label Trump what he calls everyone else. It will label him a loser, because it will be the biggest strategic loss in this nation's history, in my opinion, if Ukraine is allowed to fall back under the domination of Russia. It just makes no sense strategically. It has so many far-reaching implications, not just in terms of China, but the Caucasus, the opportunities there to peel off Georgia, to bring democratization into those areas, in terms of how the Black Sea is controlled and the flow of wheat that's coming from Ukraine, and in that whole aspect of it, and how that impacts the Mediterranean, and how Russia in the past has been able to project force with their Black Sea fleet into the Mediterranean. At this point, if you look at Russia's position on the battlefield and globally, they are set up for the loss. And yet just today, or maybe it was yesterday, Trump is coming out saying, we can't beat Putin. Really? Okay, a bunch of rebels, in Jeeps just defeated Putin in Syria. They just kicked their asses out of that country. And you're telling me that Ukraine that's fought this war, to a standstill for 3 years, can't win with the right level of support? Of course they can. If the Syrian rebels could do it, and they've just announced a couple of days ago that they're not going to be renewing the lease on the naval base or installation at Tartus in Syria, and they're not. And I forget is it Khamenein Air Base that's nearby. I may be saying that incorrectly. They're not renewing that either. I mean, Russia has a loss, and Russia is even reeling, in terms of their being able to project force into the Sahel in Africa, and so. And their economy is imploding. I mean, we could go on and on about all the different ways Russia is set up for the loss. So it's crazy that Trump would want to lose all of this. And history, in my opinion, if he does, it's not going to be kind. I mean, they're going to call him a loser, and that'll be the irony. The guy that spent more time in this country calling everyone a loser will be our country's biggest loser.
So anyone that has an MI background, military intelligence, and especially counterintelligence, is just seething at how Trump has allowed Putin to drive a wedge between NATO, and the United States, something that Russia, the Soviet Union, has been trying to do since the inception of NATO, is being done by an American president. Let me ask you, Mark, or either one of you, if you could, to answer this. Most Americans, understandably, are not experts in foreign policy, foreign relations, or even national security. How would you explain to the average American the importance of meaning the United States, losing most, if not all, of our alliances? How important are our alliances to both America's national security and our economic interests?
Yeah, let me take it quickly first, and John can focus on the NATO aspect of it. I mean, people need to understand our economy, and I'm saying this as someone who's formal in commercial banking and global commerce. It is, tied closely to the European Union. I mean, the amount of trade that goes through there is essential. And NATO, in effect, from a military standpoint, protects that relationship. It ensures the free flow of trade. And if you don't think that's important to superpowers, then people need to step back and go look at what China's been doing. I mean, a lot of their efforts to militarize the world are first coming about in terms of them creating economic lanes around the world. And one of their big targets is the European Union market. The war in Ukraine, ironically, disrupted that. And it disrupted a key belt, two key arteries that go through Ukraine that were going to basically establish rail between China and Europe. And those arteries go through there, but as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. But that's been blocked. And that's a good thing for the U.S. and our economy, to make sure that we're the dominant trade partners with the EU, and vice versa, that the EU continues to trade with us. If you settle all of that to the point where Ukraine becomes back under the domination of Russia, and by extension then China, then suddenly you're just giving this huge opening to China, the country, remember, that the Trump administration views as the pacing threat. You're giving them an inside, straight to basically say, hey, we're back in the European Union in terms of trade. So, but there's also the military component to it. And I think, John can explain that NATO is not just about protecting Europe. It's the logistics that come with NATO that help us project force in a lot of different areas of the world. John?
Yeah, there's the motto at U.S. Africa Command there in Stuttgart. The motto there is stronger together. Okay, stronger together. Alliances. When you're talking, and Mark and I have written about this before, when you're talking 3-4 conflicts at one time that the United States has input into. So Ukraine, the Middle East, Iran, China, South Korea. We cannot, as a country, singly fight 4 wars by ourselves against these powers, particularly China. Okay. So you have to go at it from alliances, and alliances give you strength. But as Mark said, the alliance of NATO is not just about deterrent, but it is mostly about deterrence of Russian aggression into Europe. But what Mark said hits the nail on the head. Logistical throughput, force projection. Okay, if we were to withdraw from NATO, okay, we would lose our air base at Ramstein, right? A central hub for all activity of U.S. force projection within Europe. We would lose our air base and our training facilities in Romania, in Constanza, Romania, which is where the majority of U.S. forces, as they went into Afghanistan, staged coming in and going out. You lose that. You lose force projection capability. Now you're completely and totally reliant upon aircraft carriers, okay, that are vulnerable to all sorts of new types of munitions. No, it's alliances are key. Alliances are critical. You work with your partners, okay? And you have to support your partners because at the end of the day, your partners are supporting you. And I'll give you an example that Mark and I talked about the other day. 9/11, the United States turned to NATO and said, we've been attacked as a sovereign country. An attack against the United States is an attack against NATO. And NATO countries partnered up, bellied up, and deployed forces to Afghanistan to help us fight in Afghanistan. Also sent forces to Iraq to help fight in Iraq. So our NATO partners have stepped up and been beside us most of the way. One of the examples I give that I think the American public can possibly think about is this. Would we as the United States just give in to Russia if they attacked Alaska and took Alaska and said, this is ours, we're going to, would we just compromise and say, you got it? And what would we say if NATO said, that's a North America problem, that's not a European problem, you guys figure it out on your own? Okay, look, a hypothetical, I got it. But Russia is very much interested in Alaska. They've always been interested in Alaska. So, I mean, is it right for America to say Russia's your problem, is not our problem? Yes, we're part of NATO, but that's not our problem. It could easily be flipped the other way. Alliances are critical. You don't get there without your partners. And again, stronger together is significant and something that we all subscribe to. As an Army guy for 30 years, I have served with many of these allied partners, and I see what their capabilities are. They may not be in some cases as capable as the United States, but when they're injected into the plan, when they're part of the maneuver force, they are a value added that, quite frankly, we just don't understand. And not just from a military perspective, but from a cultural perspective too, trying to understand your enemy, trying to understand the terrain in which we're operating on. They bring all that to the table, and to simply discount that because you're looking for future business interests with another country. I just don't understand that from a military perspective, and I honestly do not understand how the advisors right now that are surrounding Trump don't bring that to the table.
You mentioned,
David,
go ahead, Mark. No, go ahead.
Quickly add one point, on NATO. I think if we withdraw from NATO or we weaken NATO to any great extent, through a passive withdrawal, if you will, but not a literal one. I mean, that, in my opinion, is as close as we can get to committing national suicide. It's that far-reaching. The ramifications are that big. NATO is too much of a component of our overall national security, and it just would be akin to almost committing national suicide. Makes no sense. Sorry, David. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I just wanted to follow up what John was saying. You mentioned how the NATO countries came together for our aid after 9/11, the only time Article 5 has ever been enacted by NATO. And I'll tell you just a quick story why I'm thinking about that, because the first time that I met a Ukrainian was in Iraq. He was serving as a doctor in a medical unit, an army medical unit in Iraq. So here's the Ukrainians who we just stabbed in the back, and they were there in Iraq sweating with us in the desert to support us. Think about that. I'm going to close on this question. It's a follow-up to all of this. What are your thoughts on whether or not right now, with everything that's been said and done and speculated on, do you think that the United States would actually support NATO if an Article 5 alert request was issued if and when Russia invaded a NATO country? Would the United States answer the call?
So my answer to that is yes. Okay. And yes, because the men and women in uniform, from the 4-star levels, from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff down to that private in the foxhole, they know what right looks like. To not support that particular article of NATO, I think at some level would be following an unlawful order. We are committed to that through an alliance, and I think there would have to be significant pushback from from politicians, but also from the general officers to say that's not what we're going to do. So I believe that we would follow through on that, or absolutely, I think we would. Now, there may be some internal issues within Washington, D.C., but at the end of the day, we execute the mission.
Would we defend Estonia? Would Pete Hegseth issue an order from the Pentagon to defend Narva, Estonia, if the Russians came over the bridge?
Yeah, that's a great question, because right now, Pete Hegseth seems to be more of a do as Trump tells me to do, as opposed to the actual Secretary of Defense working with his combatant commanders to understand what conditions look like in Europe, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in North America, and in South America. That's a tough question. I have to believe in my heart as a military guy, and Pete Hegseth, like it or not, okay, is still a military guy at some level. I mean, he got up to the rank of major, okay, before, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure if he's still in the U.S. Army Reserves or not. I don't know, but I got to believe that the military in him would honor the obligation that the United States has signed up for. It's not his place to my position. It's not his place to say no to NATO.
What about our commander-in-chief? Would our commander-in-chief issue an order for American boots on the ground, Americans to possibly die defending Estonia? Honest answer.
My answer is I hope so. Okay.
I know you don't know. I know.
It's an uncomfortable question, but I hope so, because at the end of the day, take the businessman part and set it aside. You're an American, okay? And the American government has committed to NATO. And if that means committing U.S. forces alongside our NATO brethren to defend Estonia, that's what we do. And you could be risk averse all day the way the Biden administration was, but eventually you got to do something. Okay, eventually you go forward and you set the conditions to win. Okay, the problem largely with NATO, in a sense, every exercise I've ever been on, NATO's never won a war. NATO's pushed the aggressor back across the border, but they've never pursued the aggressor back to their capital city and destroyed them and taken them out of business. Okay, and that's probably the one fallacy in NATO, is that it stops at the border. Okay, and I got to believe that if Russia attacked Estonia, that we'd be right there defending.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's a hypothetical, obviously. The answer should be absolutely, right? There shouldn't be any debate about whether or not we would support Article 5 if called upon, for instance, in your scenario, if Estonia was. But, given where we're at, I think I've got to side with what John is saying. I'm hopeful. But it may not even be a question of just being hopeful. I think if something like that starts to happen, Poland is not going to stand by. You'll start to see a domino effect that starts to happen in Europe. And I think the U.S. would realize, you would hope that they would realize that we can't let this spiral out of control, because at some point, in terms of that kind of invasion force, can't forget, France, the UK, they have nukes and stuff. And so if we can't control it from a conventional standpoint and provide that conventional shield, then it's something that could get out of hand quickly and not end well. So, from that standpoint, I think there are reasons to believe that, if the council could get through to Trump as the commander in chief to say, you need to be doing this because the consequences of not doing it are far worse, I'm hopeful that he would. But again, Trump's his own man.
I lied. Last question, and I just want a yes or a no, because we'll pick this up next time, I promise.
Okay.
Is President Trump going to pull America out of NATO? Yes or no? Both of you?
No.
Okay, so 2 no's. Okay, gentlemen, I hope you're right. I mean, God bless America and our alliance with NATO. Seriously, I hope that what you said about America honoring Article 5, if it comes to that, and also not pulling out of NATO, are both true. I'm like both of you. I'm very, very hopeful. I'm not a prognosticator. I can't predict the future, but boy, I feel pretty bad about it. So we'll just have to wait and see. Jonathan Swede and Mark Toth, thank you very much. We have to take this up again very shortly, because, as you know, every hour is a dramatic change in the political and security landscape. So both of you, take care, stay safe, and we'll do this again soon.
David, thanks for having us back on the show.
Pleasure, David. Thank you.
You bet.